In today's video, I would like to have a brief look at a new plugin from Waves, which is specifically designed for Dolby Atmos music production. Spoiler alert, I think this is actually a nice one. And so without further ado, let's get started. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I teach at the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio. And if any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join my Discord community. An invite link is in the description below. And if you get any value out of my videos, please also don't forget to press the like button because it really helps out the YouTube algorithm. The plugin I want to talk about today is called Waves Spherix. It's actually a collection of two plugins. It's a compressor as well as a limiter, and these plugins are meant to be used on a Dolby Atmos bed within a Dolby Atmos production. And they're available in two channel formats, in 7.1.2 as well as 7.1.4. We are going to use the 7.1.2 versions because once again, we're going to use them on a Dolby Atmos bed within a Dolby Atmos production, and beds are generally limited to 7.1.2. Interestingly, this plugin solves an issue that I had in a video that I did a couple of months ago where I looked at the Hornet Sump plugin. Hornet Sump is essentially a plugin that allows you to work with Dolby Atmos objects in a very cohesive way. And back then I mentioned that the Hornet Sump plugin, or the approach that this plugin is taking, is unfortunately not really perfect for Dolby Atmos beds, because in a Dolby Atmos bed you would like to have fine control over each individual channel. Now, ironically, I walked that comment back last week in last week's video, because I felt that maybe in Dolby Atmos music production this is not a big issue. However, as it turns out, at exactly the time I was creating this video, Waves came out with this plugin that does exactly what I felt is needed to be done. And therefore I'm really excited, so let's get right into it. The way I'm going to approach this today is the way I always approach these types of videos, and that is by using a very simple Dolby Atmos project. Now, I got a little bit tired of using always the same loops. So what I've decided to do this time is create my own loops. These are actually things that I did. I apologize if you don't like them, but that's sort of the type of music that I do, or I like to do at least. So let's have a brief listen. So essentially what we have is we have a drum loop. And on top of the drum loop, we have a bass loop. And on top of the bass loop, we have a slightly trancey synth. And that's essentially pretty much it. Now, the way I'm going to use them is slightly differently to how you would normally use them. The way you would normally work with these types of tracks is that you would use them as objects in a Dolby Atmos project and then route them into the Dolby Atmos renderer. Now, because I want to demonstrate the capabilities of Waves Spherix, and Waves Spherix once again is meant to be used on a bed, I decided to route these three tracks into the bed channel, or into the bed track. And I've positioned them in such a way that all the channels in the bed track are active, so that we actually can see that there's something going on there. And that essentially means that I had the synthesis sort of slightly to the back and slightly above, so that we have some action in the head channels. We have the bass. The bass is sort of to the front, pretty close to left and right speakers. And then we have the drums, which are brought in slightly so that we have a little bit of action in the center channel, and I also moved a little bit of information into the LFE channel and also elevated them a little. So we should have action on all individual channels in the bed track, and let's just double check if that's actually the case. So if we play that now, you can actually see that here we have action on all 10 channels. Now, going from the bed is then routed into the Dolby Atmos renderer. The Dolby Atmos renderer sits on a 7.1.4 bus. So let me just open that up here. So we have the Dolby Atmos renderer. And once again, it is routed into the 10 bed channels. And we don't have any objects here because essentially we are just working with the bed today. And in order to complete the setup, I also kind of went into the ADM authoring for Dolby Atmos section and selected here we are. First of all, the internal renderer, and then once again, we have one bed channel and no object channel. That's pretty much it. Now, if you want to know on how to set up a Dolby Atmos project, I invite you to watch the video that I did a while back where I walked you through the way how to set up Dolby Atmos projects in Cubase, and essentially Nuendo is the same thing. I'll leave a link in the description below for this particular video. This is essentially everything that I did, so you don't have to worry too much about how to actually set that up. We are going to look into how Waves Spherix works. So let's add an instance of Waves Spherix to our bed channel. So let's add an insert, and the insert we're going to add is called Spherix. Now, once again, we have two versions of that plugin, a compressor and a limiter. I'm going to talk mainly about the compressor. The limiter works pretty much exactly the same way. It just has a couple of different parameters that you can change, but other than that, it's pretty much the same. And they do exist in 7.1.2 and 7.1.4 versions. We are going to only use the 7.1.2 here because, once again, our bed is a 7.1.2 track. So that's what we're going to add here. And this opens up Waves Spherix. Now, first of all, let's have a brief look at the interface that we have here. First of all, we see meters for all individual channels. And let's just play our track a little so that we see. Now we can change the metering to show us the output metering or the input metering. We can solo individual tracks or channels. So let's solo, for example, I don't know. Let's solo one of the height speakers. So that's the left height speaker. We can obviously solo multiple speakers. Whenever we do that, we see in this graphic display here which speakers are active. Here on the bottom left, we have the controls of the compressor, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. And here on top, we have a couple of settings that are fairly standard. We have an input gain, we have an output gain, we have a mix control. And here in the middle, we have the buttons that are actually going to be most important for us. These allow us to choose which channels we are currently working with. And let me just stop the music for a second. Essentially, there are three buttons on top, and they are kind of, you need to kind of get a little bit used on how they actually work. But the main idea is that you can choose to either work with each channel individually. This would be done if you set that to off. In this particular case, essentially, you have fine control over each individual channel. So you can actually go into these channels and then change the compressor settings for each channel individually. Or you can control the channels. Now, if you click on the channels, you have a couple of different options on how to group them. First of all, you can group them all in one. If you do that, essentially all the other channels are going to disappear and you're only going to see the left channel, meaning that this is everything that you essentially set on the left channel is also going to apply to all the other 9 channels as well. So you control everything with just one setting. Or you can group them. So for example, what you can do is you can group left and right channel, and that essentially means that left and right channel are now grouped to one group, and everything that I change here on this settings window is then also applied to the right channel. The same goes for the surround channel. So we have left surround, right surround, and the rear surround. So essentially I'm controlling them as one. And the height channels are also in one group. Because it's a 7.1.2 version here, I'm only having 2 height channels. If you would work with the 7.1.4 version, you would have 4 height channels. And then we have separately control over the center channel and the LFE channel. However, if I want to control the center channel together with the left and right channels, I can also do that by grouping them or by using the group left, right, and center. If I now do that, the 3 channels, the left channel, the right channel, and the center channel are now in one group. And the LFE channel separately, or I can also choose to control all 4 of them in one instance and essentially with one set of parameters. Now let's go back and set everything off. Now there are essentially 2 ways on how you can apply changes, and in order to demonstrate that, let me first make a couple of changes to one of the 2 channels that we currently have active here. And let me just turn it off here. So we are only having the left top the height speaker, so the left height speaker active here. Now, if I'm selecting that, I now have control over all the settings in this compressor. So I can control the threshold, the release, the attack time, the ratio independently for this channel only. If I turn off the auto makeup, I also have the option to change the makeup gain, which essentially allows me to change the gain of that particular track. So if I, for example, have a situation where the top speakers are too quiet, I can actually use that in order to bring up the volume. So for example, I can simply bring up the volume here. Whenever I make a change to the settings here, I will see the active knob here also in this window here. So if I'm moving that around, you can sort of see that this is also moving here below the meter. If I'm changing a different setting, then this will actually change to whatever is currently active. So if I'm now switching over to the threshold, for example, essentially I will see the threshold here, and I can change the threshold. And in order to get some compression going, I probably also need to bring the ratio up. And I can see in the meter there is currently some compression going on here. It's only applied to the left top channel. So if I'm now going bringing back the right top channel, so essentially I see that I have this is applied here and this is not applied here. Now, if I want to control them as a group, there are really two ways I can control them, and these are here listed as either the channel settings or the control settings, which tends to be a little confusing. At least it confused me a little. The main difference is that sometimes you want to control the parameters in such a way that the relative distance between those parameters stays the same, and this is done by clicking on the controls button. So if I'm now clicking on the controls button, for example, and I also need to select the group. So let me just select maybe the left-right settings. If I'm now changing the one of the settings, so for example, let me change the makeup gain. What will then essentially happen is that the distance or the difference between the makeup gains from left and right channel will actually stay the same. So they're both moving with me changing the makeup gain, but they will stay essentially in the same distance. Same goes for the threshold, for example. We have not yet set any threshold on the right one. So if I'm not changing that, I can actually see that sort of the threshold is moving accordingly, and this is more of a kind of a relative change that I'm doing. The other option is to choose the channel settings, and that essentially means that whenever I select the channel option, everything will default to the leftmost channel. So in this particular case, what's going to happen if I click on channel here, the settings for the right channel will actually kind of match the starting to match the settings for the left channel. So if I'm clicking on the channel settings here, essentially the left and right channel, you might have heard that by kind of listening to the sound, I now have kind of evened out because the right channel settings were set to match the left channel. If I now go back to the controls, essentially I see that they are now compressing in exactly the same way. So this gives you two options. Let me just stop that again. This gives you two options to work with groups. So on one hand, you can work with groups in such a way that you're controlling everything with just one set of parameters. And all these parameters are applied to all channels in that particular group identically. Or you can use the control settings where it's more of a kind of a relative change that you're doing. So when you're adding a threshold or removing threshold or doing anything else, it is applied to all channels, but they stay kind of in their relative distance to each other. Now, in addition to being able to control the compressor parameters for each channel individually or for groups of channels individually, there's also the possibility to change how the compressor is driven by the sidechain, or essentially how the individual channels are contributing to the sidechain of the compressor. And this is done in the sidechain settings of the Spherix window, and in particular by this parameter that's called weight here. In the standard settings, it's set to group, and that essentially means all the channels that are in one particular group are summed up, and that essentially drives the compressor for that particular group. But you can actually move that around to individual, which essentially means that the compressor is driven individually by each channel, so that essentially there is no summing up going on, and each channel really has its own compressor settings. Or you can move that over to all, and that essentially means that all the channels within that Dolby Atmos bed are contributing to the sidechain that drives the compressor. And that gives you a lot of flexibility on how the compressor actually works and how it reacts to. It allows you to control the individual individual groups completely independently, or kind of having them influence one another, either by kind of summing the sidechain, summing everything into the sidechain and kind of working with the compressor that way. But it allows you, gives you a lot of flexibility, and it's actually a very neat implementation of that. Now, in addition to the compressor, there's also a limiter. The limiter works pretty much in exactly the same way. So let's just have a brief look at how the limiter works, or how it looks. So let's open up our channel settings again, and let's replace the compressor with the limiter. And essentially, if you look at the limiter, you will see that everything looks pretty much exactly the same. There are a couple of changes. Obviously, we don't have an input and output gain. Obviously, the channel settings are exactly the same. The meter settings are exactly the same. We have an additional dither knob here. And obviously, we now have not compressor settings, but limiter settings. But other than that, it is pretty much exactly the same, and this makes this really a nice set of tools that is very usable for working with pads in Dolby Atmos productions. So what is my final verdict? Now, as I already said a couple of times, I really like that plugin. I think it's a very useful addition to the toolbox that you have when you're working with Dolby Atmos productions. It is a little bit pricey, but quite honestly, anybody who is working in a Dolby Atmos studio probably doesn't mind that price tag. I think it's appropriately priced, let's put it that way. If you're working in a bedroom studio or in a makeshift Dolby Atmos studio like I'm doing here, you probably kind of need to think about twice if that's something you want to do. But if you're a professional working professionally with Dolby Atmos, it's certainly something that I would highly recommend to add to your toolbox. Now, before I conclude this video, I should probably mention that there's another plugin that came out very recently. It's called PSP Aural Control from PSP AudioWare. It does something very similar to Spherix, but not exactly the same thing. Now, unfortunately, that plugin is currently only available for Pro Tools. Now, I do have a license for Pro Tools, but to be perfectly honest, I don't want to use Pro Tools, so I'm going to wait until they bring out the audio unit and VST3 versions so that I can use it in Cubase and or Nuendo. But once they do, I'm probably going to do a video about comparing those two with Spherix and PSP Aural Control. My feeling is that they're probably going to be fairly complementary, so that they actually sometimes might even be useful to use together in a Atmos bed track. But this is really everything I wanted to say today. Thanks again for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below or join my Discord community. Once again, invert link in the description below. And with that being said, see you at the next video.